Hello and welcome. This is Wendy B from Stamp Right Up. I am excited to be sharing with you today this project that I made using Stampin' Up's photopolymer stamp set from Sale-A-Bration called What I Love. Now, this is what we call a two-step stamp, and I love the fact that there's lots of coordinating images in the stamp set, along with 3 really pretty sentiments as well. So as I mentioned, this is a two-step stamp set, which means that you can actually layer the images together. And one of the great things about the Stampin' Up two-step stamping is that there's a little tab that allows you to help with placement. Now, there's a right way and a wrong way up with the stamp set, and those little tabs will help you make sure that you get a perfect image every time. So let's go ahead and start stamping it out. So I've got the So Saffron ink, and I'm going to use the middle image, as you can see on the stamp case there. And I like to pick up my photopolymer stamps from my project table so that I can make sure that they're actually firmly stuck to the block. So I'm going to go ahead and use a pencil and draw a little mark there so that when I'm stamping, I can see where I'm actually going to be aiming that little tab. So I'm going to be centering that pencil mark into the middle of that little tab that's above the flower. So when with Stampin' Up ink, I like to tap, tap, tap. I don't like to press, you don't press into the into the ink pad. And now as you can see, I'm using that little tab and I've aimed that pencil mark into the middle of that little arrow. So it doesn't look like much right now, but as you can see, as we start layering the stamps together, it'll start to become a really beautiful flower. So the next stamp that I'm going to use, I'm going to change the ink to Crushed Curry. And the next stamp that we're going to use is actually the smallest image, the image on the very right-hand side. And I'm going to do the same thing by making sure that I align the tab of the stamp to the pencil mark that I've actually got there. Now you can see that the flower is starting to take shape. Off camera, I of course clean my stamp off before I put it back onto my stamp set. And now I'm using the color called Hello Honey from the latest of the ink colors. I'm just going to lightly tap that ink onto the stamp, and then once more I'm going to align that tab with the pencil mark that I've drawn. And now that we've got all 3 stamps together, you can see that that flower comes out just beautifully. With those 3 colors together, they've come out and they're beautiful flowers. Off camera, I went ahead and restamped another one. And now we're going to go ahead and cut them out. So as you know with fussy cutting, you're going to always want to make sure that you move the paper and not your scissors. So moving around, you don't want to chomp at it, so you're trying to have an even pressure applied to the blades as they close down together. And as you can see, I'm moving the paper around so that I get a nice clean edge as I'm cutting out. That'll make sure that you don't have that raggedy chop edge, and you'll get a really nice die cut look from just using your scissors. I'm going to go ahead and cut the other one off out as well, off camera as well. So now we're going to go ahead and start stamping out the sentiment. So I've got a piece of vellum there, and I'm going to use my Versamark ink, the thank you sentiment. There is also 2 other sentiments there that you could use, but I chose to use the thank you sentiment on this one. So every time we're going to be doing heat embossing, I like to use the embossing buddy. Now inside the embossing buddy is some powder, and that I like to cover my project evenly to make sure that the embossing powder goes only where I want it to and nowhere else under my project, so I don't get little flecks. Versamark is actually a really sticky ink that allows the embossing powder to stick to where you've stamped your sentiment, and then you can go ahead and heat emboss it. I love the fact that the embossing buddy really helps make sure that you don't get powder anywhere you don't want it. So I go ahead and stamp it out, and as you can see, it's a little bit sticky, so I just pull it off with my finger there. And I've just got a scrap piece of cardstock that I'm going to go ahead and pour the embossing powder over top of. You can use a coffee filter for this, or some scrap paper. As you can see there, I've got my tweezers out now. Tweezers are my best friend when I'm crafting. I find it's a lot easier to pick up little tiny pieces, especially with nails. If you are a lady that likes to keep your nails clean, then tweezers are really helpful in placement and everything else. So this is one of my little crafting tricks I can share with you, because I use a piece of a Swiffer dusting cloth to clean up my craft area. It is amazing for picking up embossing powder and rogue glitter and every other kind of little fuzzy thing, so that when you're actually crafting, you can actually use that Swiffer, and it's amazing how quickly and easily that picks up. A little tip I learned from Jennifer McGuire. So as you can see, I've just taken my heat gun and I'm now heat embossing that sentiment until the powder is raised up and opaque. We're going to go ahead now and finish off the card. So now I've got a piece of cardstock that is 3 3/4 by 5. And using our old olive ink, we're going to go ahead and stamp the leaves. We're going to use the biggest leaf, the leaf sprig there, and that is by Clear Block D. And I'm going to go ahead and start stamping around to the outside edges. One thing you want to make sure of is that when you're stamping, that you actually leave enough room for the flower. So you don't want to go too close to the edge. Otherwise, the flower is going to end up actually covering up your stamping. So make sure that when you're stamping, you're coming a little way away from the edge. You're not actually going to go corner to corner. So you leave some room, and you don't want to cover up that beautiful stamping that you're going to be doing. So in each corner, I'm going to stamp 3 sprigs. And then in the top 2, the opposite corners, I'm going to stamp just 2. And as you can see there, we're going to end up popping that up with some foam pop dots or dimensionals. And as you can see, it's okay to actually go off the paper. It adds that sort of just a little bit of extra interest. So I'm stamping just a little bit off the paper for those corner pieces there. And then in the opposite corner, I'm going to do the same thing for the 2 sprigs. So the same thing in each opposite kitty corner. And again, these ones are actually close to the corner because we actually do want to fill that corner up because we're not going to be covering that up with our flower. But the other corner, opposite to the other flower, is actually going to have obviously the other flower. So we're going to want to make sure again with this one as we're stamping it that we're staying away from exactly in the corner and leaving some room for that flower to actually not cover up the stamping. So just laying it out to make sure I've got everything and I've got it covered up, as you can see there from my original card example. And we're going to be going ahead and popping up those flowers with some foam tape, like I said, just to get a little bit of added dimension. So let's go ahead and start assembling our sentiment flags there. So as you can see, they're just regular strips of paper, and of course all the dimensions you can find on my blog. One of the tips I find super great when I'm making a fishtail banner end is I snip up the middle, and I end up meeting that snip from both sides. That way I can always guarantee that my banner is going to be symmetrical and evenly placed. I find that if I try and approach the making the fishtail from left to right at the beginning, I can never get it straight. So that's a really easy trick that you can always use to make sure that you're getting your banners centered and even every time, is to snip up the middle and then go ahead and meet that snip on both corners. Now, when we're using vellum, we actually, you want to be careful as to what glue you're using. And we're going to be adhering this bow. So I've cut a nice little piece of the gold ribbon, the 1/8 inch gold ribbon. I love the fact that it has a white border on it. So it actually, it goes great on both white cards, card bases, and black, and even other colors. It really stands out, but it has that gorgeous hint of metallic sort of gold shimmer to the ribbon, so it really actually stands out, and it matches our sentiment really, really well. So I'm going to go ahead and reach for my roll of glue dots. And one of the other tricks I like to use with my glue dots is I actually like to stick the piece that I'm adhering to the roll, not pull the piece off of the roll instead. So as you can see there, I'm sticking it onto the paper and then pulling it off. Sometimes I find the glue dots get a little bit gummy and can sort of get pulled out and misshapen. And so one of the reasons why we're using glue dots here is because Tombow liquid glue would take quite a while to dry on the vellum. And also glue dots are much more transparent. Although Tombow does dry clear, glue dots just give you a lot more control and it's a lot quicker. So I'm going to use a bow, the same concept on the bow, and I'm going to stick the bow directly over top of the glue dot that I used to adhere down the vellum piece. That way your adhesive is actually covered up and everything is stuck down as you need it. And it's okay to not glue the rest of the flag down because it actually gives a little bit of interest for that flag to move around. Now I'm going to go ahead and use my dimensionals. As you can see, that's a very well loved piece of sheet of dimensionals, and I actually cut my dimensionals in half for a few reasons. A lot of the times I need smaller pieces than just the full dimensional, and actually it lasts me a lot longer if I can stretch my supplies by cutting the dimensionals in half. It still performs the same way if you have a whole piece versus a half a piece. It still gives you the same height and the even coverage, but you're actually using, you know, even a half to a third less of the product. So actually you can stretch your supplies out a lot. Peeling off the backing of all my dimensionals, I'm going to go ahead and adhere the flowers down to my card panel. Before I go ahead and stick all my pieces together, I like to adhere piece by piece so that if something goes wrong with a piece, I'm not actually throwing out the whole entire card. So here's our card base, and that is so saffron. And what I'm going to do is just line up the flowers because I'm going to have them sort of hanging off the edge of that 3 3/4 inch panel. And I want to make sure that I'm actually not going too far off the corners. So I'm going to line up the flowers before I adhere them down. And I'm going to glue down my bases now so I can make sure that everything is actually properly aligned. So using my Tombow, you want to make sure that as you're gluing, you're not actually placing down too much adhesive. As you can see, I'm using a very small amount of adhesive. It looks like a lot on camera, but it's just a very, very thin layer, and I spread it out as much as I can. The more adhesive you use, the more likely your paper is to ripple, and so as less is best in this case. So I also love using liquid glue because it gives me a chance to reposition my paper. One of the things I am classic at is always gluing my panels on crooked. So with that liquid glue, it gives me a chance to actually make sure that my panels are actually on straight. So as you saw, I removed the backing to my flowers original already, and I'm going ahead and adhering that down. Now that I've had my panel down, I can see where those flowers are actually supposed to go. So it's actually coming off of the top panel, but not so far that it's going to hang off the edge of the full card base itself. That card base, like I said, is a piece of So Saffron, cut to the a standard A2 size, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 once folded. And go ahead and adhering both of my flowers down. Once I've done that, I'm going to flip that base over and actually adhere that base with some dimensionals. I'm going to use some liquid glue on this piece because the crumb cake cardstock is in fact opaque, so you won't. It doesn't matter if you can see through the adhesive through or not. And I'm going to go ahead and just make a little bit of a curve in my vellum piece there, just by very gently pulling on it, the same way you would with curling ribbon. Just to give it a little bit of added interest and give it some dimension without actually having to put anything underneath the vellum. So adhering that down with the Tombow that I applied on the back of the crumb cake about halfway to the flag, I've got now my top panel pretty much ready to go. The last thing I'm going to go ahead and do is add some dimensionals to the back of this card just to give it even again a little bit more interest. And once again, I'm going to cut my dimensionals in half. Like I said, it really helps stretch your supplies, especially when you're a crazy crafter like I am. The more you can get from your supplies, the better. So I like to make sure that all of my corners are covered. And you also want to make sure that you've got some dimensionals in the middle because you don't want your card base to sag. Especially with having pieces on top and the sentiment like that. If you want to put it through the mail, the more dimensionals you have, the more coverage you have, the more likely you are to make sure that your card base actually doesn't sag. So what you can see that I'm putting there is the bare minimum that I would put to make sure that my card base doesn't sort of hang in the middle or off to the edges. So going ahead and pulling off the backing, which is always fun, as any crafter would know, we find those little pieces everywhere. I'm going to go ahead and layer this piece down. I like to make sure that when I'm layering my pieces down, I actually get directly over top of my project, and that really helps me make sure that I'm actually centering it correctly. And as you can see a little bit of my head poking through on camera because I like to make sure that I've got it aligned evenly and it's not crooked. So now I'm going to go ahead and fold it down on the score line that I've made. Now you can use your bone folder, you can use your finger. As you can see, I'm using my tweezers there just to push down the crease of the score line that I made. And ta-da, and there is your finished project. If you like, on the inside of the panel, you can actually also add a piece of white cardstock and maybe stamp the outline of the flower in So Saffron, or even on the outside of the envelope. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you liked the project, and I hope you come back and see me soon. Bye!